about the AUMF. You're done? Okay.
Yep.
So, Senator, you've been calling for a new AUMF for a while now. Do you think that what the president is doing right now to combat ISIS is illegal since he doesn't have a new AUMF?
The White House asserts that they have legal authority because of the 2001 authorization. Now, 379 members of Congress weren't even here then, and the president wasn't even in Congress then. And I think if you read that authorization, it was clearly meant to apply to the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack, and there is no suggestion by anybody that ISIL was part of the 9/11 attack. So at the best, the legal case is very, very questionable. We've needed an authorization since September of 2014, and now in the president's defense, he has said, I will welcome an authorization, and in February actually sent an authorization to us. But members of Congress, and sadly this is bipartisan and bicameral, they would prefer to criticize the president, but not vote to either authorize or stop or refine what the president is doing. Congress can't just be on the sidelines lobbing in criticisms. Congress constitutionally needs to be engaged, but more importantly, the reason that Congress should be engaged is if we're not, it suggests to our allies that we don't have resolve or that we're ambivalent. It suggests to ISIL that we're ambivalent, and especially to our troops. We got 3,600 people over there in harm's way. 10 of them have been killed in this operation. They're thousands of miles from home. They're risking their lives. What, we're not going to even do the job of debating and saying that the national mission justifies this? No, they need to know we have their back. And the way they know that is when we have a full debate about this war on ISIL and Congress puts their stamp behind it.
Senator, as I said, you've been calling for this for a while now. Do you think, what are the chances right now for Congress to actually debate and vote this AUMF? Do you think the Paris attacks did affect this?
I do. I mean, I've been disappointed that, bluntly, that my colleagues won't take this seriously. I mean, I started in June of 2014, 2 months before the first airstrike, saying, look, we may have to take military action against ISIL, but we shouldn't do it without a clear congressional authorization. And it's been discouraging that a lot of folks haven't rallied around that cause. But you're starting to see a change. So last week was not just the horrific attacks on Paris, the downing of the Russian airliner in Sinai, the horrific bombing attack, one of many now, in Beirut. These things are now happening in significant numbers. When we started the war against ISIL, they were in Iraq and Syria. Now they're in Yemen, they're in Libya, they're in Afghanistan, they're in Somalia. You've got folks in Chechnya and Russia that are now claiming allegiance to ISIL, Boko Haram in Nigeria and Cameroon claiming allegiance to ISIL. So as this gets more and more complicated, I now think more members here understand Congress has to engage. On the 6th of November, 35 House members wrote a letter, bipartisan, wrote a letter to Speaker Ryan and said it's time for Congress to act. In the hearings in the Senate, I find now I don't always have to be the one that raises these issues, because whether it's Senator Flake or Senator Risch on the Republican side or Senator Murphy or Coons on the Democratic side, others will raise this issue too.
Senator, you're talking about ISIS expanding, let's say.
Yeah.
The president said that ISIS is contained before Paris attacks. Do you agree with the president's statement?
What he said was on the battle space they've lost ground. And I will say, it's true that in northern Iraq and northern Syria, the work of the coalition has had some effect. And last week, the effort against Jihadi John, the effort against a key ISIL leader in Libya, the cutting of supply lines to Raqqa and Mosul that hurt ISIL. There have been some battlefield gains, but what we've seen is this threat is mutating and spreading. Different groups are claiming allegiance to ISIL. So no, it is, if you look at it in total, it is not being contained, it's growing and spreading, and that puts burden on our shoulders and on all the nations, especially the nations in the region, to step up and do more.
My last question about Syrian refugees. A little bit ago, Speaker Ryan called to pause the Syrian refugee program in the United States. Do you support that call?
I don't support governors or elected officials standing up and saying no Syrians. In fact, I think that is so contrary to America's values. We have the most intense vetting process for anybody who wants to come into the United States as a refugee. And we've actually added more steps to the process if they're a refugee from Syria. The Syrian, and that's appropriate, because refugees, if you don't know what their situation is, they could pose a national security risk. But Syrians have been subject to the worst humanitarian set of atrocities since World War II. It's the largest refugee problem since World War II. We are trying to convince other nations to accept Syrian refugees. If we stand up, as one of the leading nations in the world and say no Syrians under any circumstances, no 5-year-old kids, no pregnant women, no 85-year-old men, if we say no Syrians never, then we will be setting the worst example we could set for other nations. We need to have tough processes to make sure that folks can't come if we don't understand that they pose no security risk. But if they meet those processes, we shouldn't keep them out because they've already been subject to these horrible humanitarian abuses.
Thank you so much for your time,
Okay,
Senator.
thank
It's
you.
great talking to you.
You
Thank
too.
you. Wish it
Okay.
was under different circumstances.